All right, let's get started with section 4. Here's the focus question. Not all Americans embraced modern urban culture and its religious and ethnic pluralism, mass entertainment, and sexual liberation. Evangelical Protestants felt threatened by an apparent decline in traditional values and the increased visibility of Catholicism and Judaism caused by immigration. They also opposed modernists within Protestant denominations who wanted to integrate science and religion and adapt Christianity to the new secular culture. Fundamentalists, who were convinced that the Bible's literal truth was the basis of Christian doctrine, started campaigns to exorcise modernism from Christianity and restrict individual freedoms. Billy Sunday, a professional baseball player who became a revivalist preacher, was perhaps the best known of the fundamentalists, and he was said to have preached to as many as 100 million people with messages damning Darwinism and drink. Fundamentalism flowered both in rural and urban areas, and it succeeded, through prohibition, in reducing the consumption of alcohol in many places. But many Americans saw prohibition as a violation of their personal freedoms. Prohibition also earned huge profits for those who trafficked in illegal alcohol, and it encouraged pervasive government corruption. The 1925 Scopes trial in Tennessee exposed the division between traditionalism and modern secular culture. John Scopes, a public school teacher, was arrested for violating a state law that prohibited the teaching of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. His trial attracted national attention and was carried live on national radio. To fundamentalist Christians, the idea that humans had evolved over millions of years from simian ancestors contradicted the Bible's account of creation. To Scopes' defenders, including the ACLU, freedom meant the right to engage in independent thought and self-expression, and the Tennessee law showed the dangers of mixing church and state. The well-known labor lawyer Clarence Darrow defended Scopes and created a sensation when he called William Jennings Bryan to the stand as an expert witness on the Bible. Bryan showed a near-complete ignorance of modern science and an inability to deflect Darrow's sarcastic interrogation regarding the factual accuracy of biblical stories. The embarrassed Bryan died shortly after the trial ended in a guilty verdict for Scopes, though the decision was later overturned, and the movement for anti-evolution state laws expired. The battle would be fought again in the late 20th century when fundamentalism reemerged as a political force. Many rural and small-town native-born Protestants found immigrants and their cultures strange and threatening. In the 1920s, wartime demands for 100% Americanism persisted in public policy and behavior. The most militant expression of beliefs that American freedom's enjoyment should be limited according to religion and ethnicity was the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1920s. By the mid-1920s, the group claimed more than 3 million members, almost all white and native-born Protestants, many of whom were not in the South, but rather in the North and West. Going beyond attacks on blacks, the new Klan targeted immigrants, especially Jews and Catholics, and other forces like feminism, unions, and immorality that seemed to threaten American civilization and individual liberty. Although the Klan's influence waned by the end of the decade, its attacks on modern secularism and political radicalism, and its insistence that control of the nation must be returned to the citizens of the old stock, represented popular sentiments. Many new laws transformed national identity and citizenship with newly exclusive definitions and restrictions. Immigration policy was the most representative of this shift. Restrictions on immigration were nothing new given the Naturalization Act of 1790, which barred non-whites from migration, and the exclusion of various groups after 1875, including prostitutes and anarchists. Nonetheless, before World War I, the nation's doors were open to almost all white persons. In the 20s, however, pressure for the restriction of immigration became overwhelming, which was signaled more than anything by the decline in the traditional opposition to restrictions from employers, who had welcomed a large labor supply as a check on higher wages. Fears of immigrant-based political radicalism now outweighed demands for cheap labor, which employers found in African Americans who had left the South. A 1921 law restricted immigration from Europe to 357,000 per year. In 1924, Congress imposed a permanent limitation on European immigration to 150,000 per year, to be distributed according to a series of national quotas that sharply restricted the numbers from Southern and Eastern Europe in order to ensure that the descendants of the old immigrants would always outnumber those of the new. The 1924 law barred the entry of all those ineligible for naturalized citizenship, all of whom were Asians, except for Filipinos, who were designated American nationals. But in 1934, Congress established a timetable for the Philippines' independence, largely as a way to end immigration. The 1924 law effectively created for the first time the category of illegal alien, and with it the Border Patrol, which was charged with policing the land boundaries of the U.S. and empowered to arrest and deport people who entered the country in violation of the new nationality quotas or other restrictions. These citizenship debates offered an opening for Indian leaders such as Carlos Montezuma to renew their call for citizenship. This contributed to the passage of the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, which conferred citizenship on all Indians in the U.S. who did not already possess it, about 100,000 Native Americans in total. Some Indian leaders, however, criticized U.S. citizenship as another ploy by the federal government to dissolve Indian sovereignty, arguing instead that their citizenship predated the existence of the United States. The new immigration law demonstrated the intensified influence of race on public policy. By the early 1920s, both Northern and Southern political leaders agreed that blacks should be second class citizens. But race policy did not only concern blacks, but also involved the question of who would be American, particularly with regard to immigration. President Coolidge's Secretary of Labor, James Davis, argued that immigration policy, while once based on labor needs and the idea of America as an asylum of liberty, should now rest on a biological definition of the ideal population. The law also reflected progressive interests in improving the quality of democratic citizenship and showed that progressive goals were infused with pseudoscientific ideas about the superiority and inferiority of particular races. The Supreme Court admitted that the entire concept of race, which was used to determine the immigration quotas, lacked a scientific basis when it rejected the claims of an Indian born World War I veteran who wanted to become naturalized, that he was a pure Aryan and therefore white. The court argued that white was not a scientific concept, but rather part of common speech to be interpreted with the understanding of the common man. Some Americans resisted the notion that Southern and Eastern Europeans could not become citizens or could only do so by adopting Anglo-Saxon culture. Horace Kalin, who was of German Jewish origins, coined the phrase cultural pluralism to describe a society that celebrated ethnic diversity instead of suppressing it. Kalin argued that the toleration of differences was uniquely American. Anthropologists such as Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict insisted that no basis existed in science for theories of racial superiority or a hierarchy of civilizations. But their writings had little effect on public policy. The new immigrants themselves were the best advocates for a pluralist America. Each ethnic group established its own ethnic enclaves with their own institutions, churches, theaters, and newspapers. Nevertheless, they were integrated into American culture through mass consumption and mass culture. Immigrant groups facing prohibition, the Klan, and widespread anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism affirmed the validity of cultural diversity and defined the toleration of difference as an essential quality of American freedom. Immigrants reinvented themselves as ethnic Americans, claiming an equal right to participate in American life while remaining culturally distinct. Catholics and Jews celebrated their religious and ethnic cultures without surrendering their belief that they should not experience discrimination or bigotry in public life. The Supreme Court helped secure this shift in law by striking down a Nebraska statute prohibiting instruction in languages other than English, which had been intended to ban the teaching of German from education. These court decisions imbued the 14th Amendment with new life and gave pluralism a constitutional foundation, paving the way for the court's elaboration of a constitutional right to privacy. The decade also saw a rising black self-consciousness, especially in the North's urban ghettos. Almost 1 million blacks had left the South in the Great Migration, moving to New York, Chicago, and countless smaller cities. Harlem in New York became a center of African American life, attracting migrants from the South and the West Indies, among whom were many well-educated professional and white-collar workers who were shocked by American racism. Whites slummed in Harlem, visiting its dance halls, jazz clubs, and speakeasies, and contributing to depictions of Harlem as a place of primitive passions. But the real Harlem was a place of poverty and low-wage work created and reinforced by housing discrimination. Harlem contained a dynamic black cultural community with connections to New York's artistic mainstream. Poets and novelists such as Langston Hughes and Claude McKay were sponsored by white intellectuals and published by white presses. And for the first time, Broadway presented black actors in serious roles, as well as shows that featured black singers. In art, the term New Negro meant rejecting established stereotypes and engaging in the search for black values to replace them. This led the writers of what became the Harlem Renaissance to the roots of the black experience in Africa, the rural South's folk culture, and life in the urban ghetto. Herbert Hoover seemed destined for a successful term as president. The son of an Iowa blacksmith and a schoolteacher, Hoover made a fortune as a mining engineer in Asia, Africa, and Europe. He became famous for coordinating food relief in Europe during World War I. Hoover exemplified what was called the new era of American capitalism. In 1922, while he was Secretary of Commerce, Hoover published American Individualism, in which he condemned government regulation for interfering with the economic opportunities of ordinary Americans. Yet he also argued that self interest should be subordinate to public interest. Hoover thought himself a progressive, but he preferred what he termed associational action, in which private agencies directed regulatory and welfare policies to government intervention in the economy. When Coolidge declined to run for president, Hoover won the Republican nomination. He celebrated the era's prosperity and promised an end to poverty. He faced Alfred E. Smith, a Democrat and the first Catholic presidential nominee of a major party. Smith was born into poverty on New York's Lower East Side, became a Tammany Hall politician, and, although Irish, emerged as the spokesman for the new immigrants. He supported progressive social legislation, and in his 3 terms as New York's governor secured laws limiting hours for women and children at work. Smith denounced the Red Scare and called for the repeal of Prohibition. Smith's Catholicism became the primary campaign issue and symbolized a cultural clash between native-born Protestant whites and the new immigrants. Hoover won the election with 58% of the vote, even carrying some traditionally Democratic states where hostility towards Catholics and immigrants was strong. Smith's campaign, which won the support of urban voters, farmers, and African Americans in northern cities, laid the basis for the triumphant Democratic coalition of the 1930s. In his inaugural address, Hoover identified crime, usually considered to be a local issue, as a concern of national importance. One example of these efforts was the Wickersham Commission, which examined the causes of crime and proposed remedies. To support enforcement, Hoover systematized federal crime reporting, expanded the nation's prison system, and increased the size and scope of enforcement agencies such as the Bureau of Investigation, the Border Patrol, and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. So that was our 4th question, or our section, and we'll be back with you for the 5th.